Greetings, fellow humans. Katrina here. Quick disclaimer, I'm a professional, not your professional. Nothing I'm about to say should be taken as medical, legal, or otherwise advice. This podcast is purely for education and amusement. That is it. Disclaimer over. So today I thought I'd talk a bit about what I don't know about trigger warnings, and I didn't know a lot about them before they became really popular lately. They did start coming about in the 1990s, but they really gained popularity in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. So the thing that I'm reading from today is from Psychology Today. A PhD, Diane Grande, wrote this piece, and she wrote it on trigger warnings on social media posts. 6 ways trigger warnings may be harmful to trauma survivors and the general public. So she goes through the key points and then goes through the harmful consequences of trigger warning. There's 6 of those, and then gives her final thoughts on it. And there's a few references that I'll put in the information box. So let's get into it. The use of trigger warnings, actually, before we get into the deep of it, I should say the key points. So the key points, there's 4 of them, and that's that among the general public, many are still calling for the continued use of trigger warnings, or I've also heard it called activation warning, mindfulness warning, or disturbing content warning. Second point is research consistently shows that trigger warnings are not helpful, may be harmful in various ways. Harm includes a tendency to backfire, increased anxiety, and reinforcement of avoidance behavior. One of the things that's helpful to learn is what triggers are, not to avoid said triggers, but to then cope with them and endure that temporary discomfort. So lastly, the key point is trigger warnings likely undermine developing emotional resilience, a critical trait in anxiety management. So the use of trigger warnings has been controversial for almost a decade now, with many people still calling for their use, while many others point to the lack of evidence to their effectiveness, not to mention their potential to cause more harm than good. Trigger warnings on social media posts. This is specific to social media posts about various topics. She says, was struck recently by the controversy that followed when a psychologist and author Nicole LePera, aka the holistic psychologist, posted an Instagram about her decision not to use trigger warnings with her posts. While tens of thousands of her 7 million followers appeared to agree with her by liking her post, many others disagreed. The protesters mostly stated the usual reasons for the continued use of trigger warnings and/or content warnings, such as their assumed helpfulness in allowing viewers to avoid exposure to disturbing stimuli, or to be better prepared to manage their reaction to those stimuli if they choose to view them anyway. The view of most mental health experts. An abundance of research evidence indicates that trigger warnings are not effective in avoiding possibly disturbing content or reducing the level of anxiety experienced when viewing the content. And that was a study done in 2018, a study done in 2020, and then in 2023. In light of this evidence, mental health clinicians and academics have been consistent in their disapproval of these warnings. As far back as 2015, Psychology Today authors have written posts about the risks involved with the use of trigger warnings. Not exclusively trauma survivors. Apparently, the community of viewers of mental health-related social media sites isn't getting the message. Following is a summary list of points made by prior authors about the potential harm of the pervasive use of trigger warnings to both survivors of trauma and the general public using social media. The research cited involved both participants who were survivors of trauma and those who did not report any history of trauma, making the results relevant to the public in general. So these are the harmful consequences of trigger warnings. Like I mentioned before, there are 6 of them before the final thoughts. 1. Trigger warnings tend to backfire. A warning not to view something can paradoxically cause people to become more and more curious and interested in the content. This is called the forbidden fruit effect, as it was evidenced in a recent meta-analysis, When given trigger warnings, research participants with both a history of trauma either showed no difference in their frequency of engagement or showed an increase in their engagement with the disturbing content. That's from Bridgland's study in 2023. 2. Anticipatory anxiety increases when trigger warnings are given. Study participants who were given trigger warnings showed more anticipatory anxiety than those who were not shown trigger warnings. They reported more nervousness, concern, and fearfulness before they ever viewed the content than those who were not warned. That was from a study in 2018. 3. The expectation of feeling distress leads to greater distress. The nocebo effect occurs when expectations of harm or poor outcomes results in worse outcomes than no expectations at all. Study participants who were shown trigger warnings had an increase in anticipatory anxiety, but had no benefit from receiving the warnings. That was from a study in 2019. 4. Avoidance of stress or anxiety reinforces the anxiety. The basic purpose behind avoiding triggers is faulty, since avoidance leads to further avoidance and generally leads to ongoing high anxiety about a situation. Treatment of anxiety and PTSD symptoms involves identifying and managing triggers using the tools provided in therapy. Its goal is not the avoidance of triggers. And that was from 2012. 12 years ago? Yeah. 5. Using trigger warnings reinforces a mindset in trauma survivors that their trauma is a core part of their identity. Those survivors who view their past trauma as a core part of their identity tend to have worse symptoms than those who do not. A person whose identity is based upon being a victim of any kind is likely to see themselves as more vulnerable and less in control of their own life choices. That's from 2011 as well as 2020. 6. Trigger warnings prevent emotional growth. It's through facing and accepting fear, allowing it to pass, and knowing it will end, that we gain resilience. We learn that our feelings of anxiety are tolerable and that they become more tolerable with practice. In contrast, trigger warnings inadvertently undermine emotional resilience. It's from 2020. And the final thoughts. Each person may react differently to a trigger warning, depending on their predisposition to feeling anxious, as well as their personal history of trauma, whether diagnosed or not. Each of these points indicates the possibility that trigger warnings do more harm than good. Several of the studies showed no noticeable difference between participants who were warned and those who were not. It cannot be said definitively that trigger warnings are harmful, but it is clear they are not helpful and may be harmful. Lastly, you may encounter many defeats, but you must not be defeated. Please remember that your difficulties do not define you. They simply strengthen your ability to overcome. That is a quote from Maya Angelou. So like I said, post the references in the information box. If you'd like to support the show, you can click the button in the box. This was fun. And I remember I was going to mention one other thing before I sign off about trigger warnings. And that was, I think that there was a meta-analysis. Yeah, there was a recent meta-analysis of 12 studies concluding trigger warnings have no effect on emotional responding to negative material or educational outcomes. Anecdotally, I've also heard of people who prefer trigger warnings, people who say that they don't want to view certain content, and so the warning that's there that appears on a social media post telling them this is a disturbing thing to view, then they listen to that. Some people do, and then they don't view that content, and then they don't feel upset by that content. That's kind of the theory behind it, I think, is that avoidance is somehow helpful, but it's really not. Avoidance in and of itself can be used strategically to reduce feelings of like anger. If somebody texts you and pisses you off, avoid returning a response immediately. That's where avoidance can be useful. But when we avoid a trigger, it can have more detrimental effects, in my personal opinion. And the rise of trigger warnings has really changed like the DIE or DEI, right? So diversity, equity, and inclusion landscape. And so by the late 1990s, that was the term you would see on feminist message boards, other places that were popular that people frequented. And nowadays, before discussing potentially traumatic topics, not necessarily traumatic, but potentially traumatic, things that are trauma, like sexual violence, self-harm, or other forms of violence, people think maybe a trigger warning, or TW for short, can be helpful. And these days, it says in another article that there are people who are quick to raise like the trigger flag and say that someone harmed or traumatized them. And that victim mindset is probably not very helpful. It says, but there's also room for the person who's triggered to take responsibility for their own trigger and work to heal it. And so I really got a bunch of this information from a variety of places. Mostly it was from that Psychology Today that I read from by Dr. Diane Grande, PhD, and I'll put the link in the box. So have a great day, everyone. And thank you so much simply for existing.